The 1970s were a dark decade for automotive safety. Car companies were struggling to meet new emissions regulations, fuel economy standards, and cost-cutting pressures, often sacrificing reliability and safety in the process. Many vehicles of this era were built fast and cheap, with little regard for crashworthiness or structural integrity. Some were so poorly engineered that they didn't just perform badly, they killed people. Here are 8 of the worst cars from the 1970s that turned highways into danger zones.
Dear viewer, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for your support.
Number 8. At the dawn of the 1970s, General Motors saw the future, and it was small. Imports like the Volkswagen Beetle, Toyota Corolla, and Datsun 510 were stealing the American market's heart with their efficiency and practicality. GM's answer was the Chevrolet Vega, launched in 1970 as a revolutionary subcompact that promised lightweight construction, cutting-edge materials, and advanced engineering. It was billed as a better small car built the American way. But what arrived on the roads was a nightmare wrapped in bright paint and chrome. The Vega was a case study in corporate overconfidence, rushed engineering, and fatal shortcuts. GM's engineers were told to build something new and bold, but not to spend too much time or money doing it. The result was a car that rusted quickly, overheated easily, and folded like foil in a crash. What began as a promising step into modernity ended up becoming one of the most infamous failures in American automotive history. A bold concept, lightweight innovation, on paper. When Chevrolet unveiled the Vega in 1970, it was hailed as a technological showcase. Its highlight was the all-aluminum inline-4 engine, a 2.3-liter unit that promised to combine lightweight with efficiency. The block was cast using a new sleeveless aluminum silicon alloy process, something never before attempted on a mass-produced American car. In theory, this design would save weight and resist corrosion. In practice, it was a disaster. The high silicon content caused cylinder wall wear, and the engine quickly lost compression. The aluminum warped under heat, and head gasket failures became routine, sometimes within the first 20,000 miles. Chevrolet had promised longevity and innovation. Owners got oil consumption, overheating, and frequent rebuilds. GM's own engineers later admitted the Vega's engine should never have left the test lab. The body that rusted before it rolled. If the engine wasn't enough trouble, the Vega's body structure sealed its fate. GM's new automated assembly plant in Lordstown, Ohio was designed for high-speed production, but corners were cut to meet volume targets. Paint quality control was inconsistent, and cheap steel panels were left unprotected from moisture. Many Vegas began showing rust within the first year, particularly around wheel arches and rocker panels. In snowy states, the floorboards and subframes could corrode through before 50,000 miles. Owners joked that you could see daylight through the floor by the time the car was 3 years old. It wasn't just cosmetic. The rust weakened the structure so badly that even minor collisions could twist the frame or shear suspension mounts. Crash tests, when metal turns to paper. The Vega's crashworthiness was notoriously poor. Despite being designed after safety standards had tightened in the late 1960s, it fared terribly in both internal and federal crash evaluations. The lightweight structure and minimal reinforcement made it crumple catastrophically in front-end and side impacts. In 1973 NHTA tests, the Vega's passenger compartment collapsed, trapping and potentially crushing occupants even in 30-mile-per-hour frontal impacts. A GM safety engineer famously remarked, "In a crash, the Vega's structure doesn't deform, it disintegrates." Door latches often failed, and the thin roof pillars buckled under rollover loads. Fuel tanks, placed behind the rear axle, were exposed and vulnerable, raising fears of fire similar to the later Ford Pinto. By mid-decade, insurers ranked the Vega among the most dangerous cars to drive in its size class. The engine, a lightweight catastrophe. The Vega's 2.3-liter engine was originally meant to showcase GM's metallurgical innovation, but instead it became an example of how theory and real-world conditions don't mix. Key problems included overheating. The aluminum block expanded more than the iron head, leading to gasket leaks. Oil consumption. Cylinder walls wore down rapidly, causing engines to burn oil excessively. Vibration. The long-stroke design caused balance issues that shook the entire car. Warping. Prolonged heat cycles deformed the head and block, making rebuilds nearly impossible. GM's fixes, like hardened cylinder coatings and redesigned coolant passages, came too late. By the time improvements reached dealerships, the Vega's reputation was destroyed. Public backlash and lawsuits. Chevrolet dealers were inundated with warranty claims. Engines seized, hoods rusted through, and suspensions sagged, all within a few years of ownership. Consumer Reports and other publications warned buyers away, citing poor reliability, weak construction, and rapid corrosion. Lawsuits emerged over premature failure and safety issues. GM tried to recover by introducing the Cosworth Vega in 1975, a high-performance version with a twin-cam, fuel-injected engine, but it was too little, too late. Buyers had lost faith. The Vega name had become synonymous with failure, fragility, and corporate denial. The human cost, a safety and ethical disaster. While Ford's Pinto became the era's most notorious, dangerous car, the Vega was not far behind. Reports of fatal accidents and moderate speed collisions were disturbingly common. The combination of rust-weakened frames, poor crash absorption, and fragile aluminum components meant that even survivable impacts often became lethal. Internal GM safety data revealed that passenger survival rates in frontal crashes were significantly lower than competitors like the Volkswagen Beetle or Toyota Corolla. But GM continued to build and market the car aggressively until declining sales forced the line's closure in 1977. Legacy: Lessons from Failure. The Vega's collapse taught Detroit, painfully, that innovation without durability is meaningless. GM's obsession with automation and low cost had backfired. Instead of creating a world-class compact, they had built one of the most fragile vehicles ever sold in America. The Vega's legacy influenced future models like the Chevrolet Chevette and Citation, but also changed GM's approach to quality control and materials science. Ironically, the Vega's worst features, its corrosion-prone steel, untested alloys, and careless assembly, became case studies in engineering schools on what not to do. Specifications: typical 1973 Vega hatchback. Engine: 2.3-liter inline-4 aluminum, L11. Power: 90 horsepower at 4,400 RPM. Torque: 125 pound-feet at 2,400 RPM. Transmission: 4-speed manual, 3-speed automatic. 0 to 60 miles per hour, 13.5 seconds. Top speed: 98 miles per hour. Curb weight: 2,300 pounds. MPGs: 25 city, 32 highway when it ran properly. Conclusion: a rusted legacy of broken promises. The Chevrolet Vega was supposed to be GM's triumph, the dawn of a new, efficient, forward-thinking era. Instead, it became a cautionary tale of hubris and haste. Its aluminum engine warped, its steel body dissolved, and its structure folded in crashes. The Vega proved that when a corporation ignores durability and safety for marketing and volume, disaster follows. Today, few Vegas remain, most having succumbed to rust long ago. Those that survive are more museum curiosities than collector's items. Reminders of when America's biggest automaker tried to reinvent the small car and accidentally invented one of the most dangerous and short-lived compacts ever made. Number 7. The Pontiac Firebird Trans Am, introduced at the dawn of the 1970s, represented both the zenith and downfall of the American muscle car era. Conceived as Pontiac's answer to the Chevrolet Camaro Z/28 and the Ford Mustang Mach-1, the Trans Am promised track-ready performance straight from the factory. However, beneath its racing stripes and shaker hoods lurked a volatile combination of raw power, poor balance, and 1970s engineering compromises, creating one of the most thrilling yet dangerous American cars of its time. When Pontiac unveiled the Trans Am in 1969, it borrowed its name, without permission, from the SCCA Trans-American Racing Series. Ironically, the car had little in common with actual race-spec Trans Am cars. Still, Pontiac wanted to sell an image, a street machine that looked like it belonged on the track. By 1970, the redesigned second-generation Firebird wore a sleeker fastback body, muscular flares, and a low stance that oozed aggression. Its purpose was clear, or so Pontiac thought. The Trans Am was supposed to be a high-performance, precision-handling car that could rival European sports machines. But the execution told a different story. The Trans Am came with massive power plants, the 400 cubic inch Ram Air 3 and 4 V8s, and later the 455 HO, high output. These engines could turn out 335 to 370 horsepower and near 500 pound-feet of torque in early versions. However, that much power in a front-heavy layout combined with poor weight distribution made the car notoriously unstable at speed. Drivers often underestimated how quickly the rear wheels could lose traction. The torque surge would overwhelm the tires, sending the car sideways with little warning. Inexperienced owners, particularly younger drivers attracted by the car's macho image, frequently lost control, and many of those accidents were fatal. By the mid-1970s, insurance companies had labeled the Trans Am a high-risk vehicle, often refusing coverage for drivers under 25. While Pontiac engineers fitted stiffer suspension and front disc brakes, the Trans Am still struggled with fundamental balance. The long nose housed a huge cast-iron V8, while the rear axle sat light and prone to hopping under power. At highway speeds or during evasive maneuvers, this setup could turn deadly. Test drivers described it as a car that punished mistakes. One wrong input, and the rear end would swing out violently. The heavy steering and vague feedback didn't help, leaving many drivers unaware of how close they were to losing grip until it was too late. Pop culture and Pontiac's marketing department helped mythologize the Trans Am. Movies like Smokey and the Bandit later immortalized it as the ultimate outlaw's car. But in the early 1970s, the Trans Am was more dangerous than daring, a wolf in wolf's clothing. It invited aggressive driving, but lacked the refinement, brakes, or stability to make that behavior survivable. Consumer reports and safety groups began raising concerns about the Firebird's accident statistics, especially among younger male drivers. Even professional testers admitted that the Trans Am demanded respect. It wasn't just fast, it was unforgiving. By 1975, tightening emission regulations and the oil crisis began to choke the Trans Am's performance. The mighty 455 was detuned, and horsepower ratings fell dramatically. Yet despite losing speed, the Trans Am kept its muscle car looks, a cosmetic warrior that still sold on attitude rather than ability. It survived the muscle car extinction of the mid-1970s by trading true performance for style. Ironically, that saved the model line, but also ended the era of the terrifyingly raw early Trans Ams. The 1970 to 1976 Pontiac Firebird Trans Am stands as a cautionary tale of automotive excess. It was powerful enough to thrill, yet poorly balanced enough to kill. Its heavy front, twitchy rear, and unpredictable dynamics made it one of the most infamous hero cars of its time, admired for its looks, feared for its temperament. Today, collectors and enthusiasts celebrate its style and raw muscle, but history remembers it as the car that proved brute force without control is a formula for disaster. Number 6. The LTD II. The LTD II, which was produced between 1977 and 1979, was supposed to be a mid-size replacement for the original full-size LTD, but anyone who saw or drove one knew better. The LTD II was enormous, ponderous, and outdated almost the moment it left the assembly line. It became one of the most ill-handling, accident-prone sedans of its time, remembered not for its comfort or style, but for how terrifying it could be to drive in an emergency. The Ford LTD II was introduced in 1977 as part of a confusing realignment of Ford's lineup. The standard LTD had been downsized, and Ford needed something to fill the gap between that and the Torino and Gran Torino. The result was the LTD II, a car built on the aging Torino platform, already known for its bulk and sloppy handling. Ford's marketing promised luxury in motion, a smooth, quiet cruiser for the average American family. But what buyers got was a gigantic, heavy, and sluggish machine that felt like a rolling contradiction. While competitors were lightening their cars and improving safety, Ford doubled down on mass and chrome. The LTD II weighed nearly 4,000 pounds, depending on trim and engine choice. With its full-frame construction, long wheelbase, and heavy V8s, it was less a car and more a land yacht. Despite being labeled mid-sized, it stretched nearly 218 inches long, longer than some Cadillacs. This immense size made parking a nightmare and quick maneuvers nearly impossible. The body roll was extreme, steering response slow, and visibility limited, all deadly flaws when avoiding hazards on the road. Crash data from the late 1970s showed that the LTD II's braking distances were alarmingly poor, especially in wet conditions. With drum brakes in the rear and no anti-lock system, panic stops were unpredictable, often ending in collisions that lighter cars could have avoided. The LTD II's suspension was tuned purely for comfort. That meant a soft, wallowing ride that soaked up bumps, but also erased any sense of road feel. Steering was overboasted and disconnected, requiring multiple turns of the wheel to change direction. Drivers described the experience as piloting a couch on wheels. Tests by Car and Driver and Consumer Reports criticized its massive understeer. The car would plow straight ahead in corners instead of turning. In emergency lane changes or high-speed situations, it behaved unpredictably, sometimes fishtailing due to the sheer momentum of its mass. Combined with the era's bias-ply tires and rear-wheel drive layout, the LTD II could easily spin out or lose traction. Under the hood, the LTD II offered a range of engines: the 302, 351, 400, and even the 460 cubic inch V8 in early versions. But thanks to strict emissions controls and low compression ratios, these engines produced anemic power, often less than 180 horsepower. Acceleration was sluggish, with 0 to 60 miles per hour times exceeding 12 to 14 seconds in most trims. Worse, fuel economy hovered in single digits, making the car impractical during the gas crisis. When you combined weak power with massive weight and poor brakes, you had a recipe for disaster. Drivers often found themselves unable to accelerate out of danger or stop in time to avoid it. Before anti-lock brakes, ABS, became standard, large sedans like the LTD II were particularly hazardous in sudden braking scenarios. Tests by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration during the late 1970s found that cars of its type had braking distances exceeding 200 feet from 60 miles per hour, nearly double that of modern sedans. The combination of slow steering response, poor braking, and heavy mass meant that many LTD IIs were involved in multi-vehicle collisions or rollovers during evasive maneuvers. The car's sheer size gave a false sense of security, but in real-world accidents, its crumple zones were inadequate, and its body-on-frame design transferred more force to occupants. Ford's advertisements for the LTD II showcased plush interiors, vinyl tops, and chrome grilles, the last hurrah of 1970s American luxury excess. The car even appeared in police fleets and TV shows like Starsky and Hutch, giving it a brief moment of fame. But reality didn't match the glamour. Owners complained of poor gas mileage, weak braking, wandering steering, and constant maintenance issues. By 1979, it was clear that the LTD II was out of touch with both consumer needs and safety expectations. As the 1980s began, the car's massive frame and floaty handling became symbols of a bygone era, the last gasp of the oversized Detroit cruiser. The LTD II was quickly forgotten after its short production run. When the downsized Ford LTD and later the Crown Victoria arrived, they rendered the LTD II obsolete almost overnight. Today, it's remembered mainly by collectors of obscure 1970s iron, or by those who survived driving one in its prime. It serves as a vivid reminder of how automotive overconfidence and engineering stagnation led to the end of America's big car era. Conclusion: a rolling symbol of excess. The 1977 to 1979 Ford LTD II perfectly encapsulated everything wrong with Detroit in the late 1970s. Too big, too heavy, too thirsty for an era of fuel shortages, and too outdated for a world rapidly demanding efficiency and safety. In an age before ABS and modern crumple zones, the LTD II's slow steering response, poor braking, and massive frame made it not just an uncomfortable relic, but a dangerous one. It was the kind of car that made drivers feel invincible, right until physics proved otherwise. Number 5. The Dodge Dart, built from 1970 to 1976, was one of Chrysler's most popular compact cars. It was affordable, simple, and famously durable, a dependable workhorse for millions of American families, students, and retirees. But beneath that reputation for reliability lay a darker truth. The Dart was also a product of the pre-crash safety era, a time when strength was mistaken for safety. In frontal impacts, the Dart's rigid construction, once praised for solid American engineering, became a weapon against its own passengers. Its hard metal dashboard, unyielding steering column, and lack of proper crumple zones turned survivable accidents into fatal ones. By the late 1960s, Dodge needed a smaller, economical car to compete with Ford's Falcon and Chevrolet's Nova. The Dart, originally introduced in the early 1960s, was refined into its most recognizable form in 1970. Built on Chrysler's A-body platform, it was simple, rugged, and inexpensive to maintain. It came with a wide range of engines, from the efficient slant-six 198 and 225 to powerful small-block V8s like the 318 and 340, giving buyers everything from economy to mild performance. For its day, the Dart seemed like the perfect compromise: tough, affordable, and reliable. What nobody knew at the time was that this toughness came at a terrible cost in collisions. In the 1970s, American car ads often boasted that cars were built like tanks. The Dodge Dart fit that slogan perfectly. Its unibody structure was extremely stiff, and its front section was designed to resist deformation rather than absorb it. However, safety engineers would later learn that this was exactly the opposite of what saved lives. Instead of dissipating crash energy, the Dart's rigid frame transferred the full force of impact directly to the occupants. During a frontal impact, the steering column, a solid steel shaft, could collapse into the driver, while passengers struck the hard metal dashboard, a deadly surface lined with chrome and sharp edges. The 1970 to 1976 Dodge Dart dashboard was a brutal relic of 1950s design thinking. Unlike later cars that featured padded materials and energy-absorbing structures, the Dart's dash was solid steel, topped with thin vinyl that provided little cushioning. In crashes over 30 miles per hour, test dummies and real-world drivers frequently sustained severe chest, head, and facial injuries from slamming into the unyielding dash, glove box edge, or metal radio knobs. Before airbags and soft interior trim became common, this interior rigidity was lethal. Even seatbelts couldn't fully protect occupants when the cabin itself refused to absorb impact energy. The concept of crumpled zones, sections of a car designed to deform in a crash to absorb energy, was pioneered by Mercedes-Benz in the late 1950s, but American automakers were slow to adopt it. The Dodge Dart's front structure, rather than collapsing safely, acted like a battering ram. In a frontal impact, the solid front frame rails held their shape, forcing the kinetic energy backward into the passenger compartment. The result was horrifying. The car might appear intact from the outside, but occupants suffered catastrophic deceleration forces, resulting in crushed chests, internal injuries, or fatal skull trauma. It was a case where structural integrity became a liability. One of the most dangerous features of early 1970s cars, including the Dart, was the non-collapsible steering column. In high-speed collisions, the steering shaft often speared backward toward the driver. Although federal safety standards later required collapsible columns, many Darts were built before these rules took full effect, or others used early designs that only partially absorbed impact. Drivers involved in head-on crashes sometimes suffered impalement or severe chest trauma, as the steering wheel was driven into their ribs by the force of the engine block shifting backward. To be fair, by 1970 standards, the Dart wasn't uniquely unsafe. Most compact cars of the era lacked true crash engineering. But what made the Dart's case so tragic was its false sense of safety. Owners viewed it as tough, solid, and dependable, qualities that, ironically, made it more deadly in accidents. Its reputation for durability concealed the fact that it performed poorly in both frontal and side impact tests compared to later vehicles. According to NHTSA crash data in the early 1980s, compact sedans from the 1970s, like the Dart, had fatality rates nearly double those of cars built just a decade later, largely due to structural rigidity and outdated interior design. Police reports and insurance studies from the mid-1970s frequently noted higher injury severity in frontal collisions involving Darts and similar Chrysler A-body models. Even moderate speed impacts often resulted in broken limbs, skull fractures, and fatal chest compression injuries, particularly for unbelted passengers. Rear-end and side impacts also exposed the car's structural weakness. Thin door beams and a fuel tank positioned close to the rear bumper. While not as explosive as the Ford Pinto's design, the Dart's fuel system and lack of reinforcement still posed serious risks. Despite these safety flaws, the Dodge Dart remains fondly remembered for its mechanical toughness. Its slant-six engine was nearly indestructible, and the car's simple layout made it a favorite of mechanics and taxi fleets. Even today, Darts can be found running reliably decades later, a testament to Chrysler's mechanical durability. However, in the context of automotive safety history, the Dart represents a transitional period, a car built at the crossroads between brute strength and genuine safety. It showed that being built strong didn't mean being built safe. The 1970 to 1976 Dodge Dart was a paradox, a tough, long-lasting car that often failed to protect its occupants when it mattered most. Its rigid dashboard, lack of crumple zones, and unforgiving cabin design turned what might have been minor crashes into deadly ones. It wasn't malicious engineering, just outdated thinking. Automakers of the time valued solidity over survivability, unaware that real safety came from controlled deformation, not resistance. In hindsight, the Dart stands as a warning from a forgotten era, when America's most dependable cars could also be its most dangerous. Number 4. In the early 1970s, the Lincoln Continental Mark IV embodied everything Americans associated with wealth, success, and prestige. It was massive, elegant, and intimidating, a rolling fortress of chrome, leather, and luxury. With its opera windows, long hood, and sharp Continental spare tire hump on the trunk, the Mark IV was unmistakably a car for the rich and powerful. But behind its regal appearance and pampered ride, the Mark IV was also a dangerous relic of an outdated design philosophy, one that valued mass and comfort over safety and maneuverability. It was a car that protected its own occupants with sheer weight, but caused catastrophic destruction to everything else on the road. In collisions with smaller vehicles, the Mark IV didn't just win, it annihilated. By 1972, Lincoln was at the height of its prestige war with Cadillac. The Mark IV was Ford Motor Company's answer to the Cadillac Eldorado, a symbol of status in an age obsessed with size and style. Stretching nearly 19 feet long and weighing almost 5,000 pounds, it was one of the heaviest coupes ever built. The car featured hidden headlamps, opera windows, real wood trim, and thickly padded leather interiors. It was powered by a 460 cubic inch or 7.5-liter V8, tuned for smoothness rather than performance. The result was a car that glided silently over bumps, but handled like a small barge. The Mark IV's luxury was unquestionable, but so was its mass. And in the physics of car crashes, mass meant everything. In the 1970s, the public, and even automakers, believed that bigger cars were automatically safer. Lincoln's advertising leaned into this belief, describing the Mark IV as built like a bank vault and solid as Lincoln itself. But this logic only applied to the driver of the larger vehicle. In multi-car collisions, the Mark IV's sheer mass became a lethal weapon against smaller cars. Crash data later revealed a chilling truth. When a 5,000-pound luxury coupe collided with a 2,500-pound compact car, the smaller vehicle absorbed nearly 3 times the kinetic energy, often resulting in fatal injuries to its occupants, even in moderate-speed crashes. The Lincoln's front end, designed for durability, not controlled deformation, resisted bending or collapsing. Instead, it pushed straight through the opposing vehicle. Unlike modern safety engineering, which uses crumple zones to absorb energy impact, the Mark IV was designed with a rigid structure meant to remain intact. While this protected its own passengers from immediate impact trauma, it magnified the lethality of every collision for others on the road. In multi-vehicle pileups, these land yachts often crushed smaller cars flat beneath their frames. Insurance analysts in the 1970s even noted that full-size luxury coupes like the Mark IV killed with kindness, protecting their drivers while destroying anything in their path. Inside, the Mark IV's interior reflected luxury and excess. Thick leather upholstery, chrome switches, real wood appliques, and acres of soft carpeting. But this comfort concealed a number of safety oversights. No airbags. Standard safety systems like airbags wouldn't appear until the next decade. Rigid dashboard design. Despite some padding, the underlying structure was still steel, posing a hazard in severe collisions. Lack of head restraints in early models led to frequent whiplash injuries. Heavy steering column. Though partially collapsible, it still presented risk in high-speed crashes. What this meant was that while the Mark IV felt safe and protective, it offered only illusionary safety, designed more for psychological reassurance than for real-world crash survivability. Another critical issue was maneuverability. At nearly 19 feet long and over 2.5 tons, the Mark IV had the stopping distance of a truck. Its power-assisted drum brakes, later replaced by discs, were barely adequate for its weight, leading to brake fade and long stopping distances. Steering was soft and over-assisted, with little road feedback. Drivers described the car as floating, a sensation of comfort on straight highways, but a recipe for disaster in emergency maneuvers. Avoiding a collision was nearly impossible when the car's own mass fought against its reflexes. As a result, many accidents involving the Mark IV were single-vehicle crashes, loss of control on curves, or during panic braking, where the car simply couldn't respond in time. Throughout the 1970s, traffic safety data began revealing a disturbing pattern. Large, heavy luxury cars like the Lincoln Mark IV, Cadillac Eldorado, and Chrysler Imperial had lower driver fatality rates, but much higher partner fatality rates in multi-car crashes. In other words, the people inside the Mark IV often walked away, while the people in the smaller cars they hit didn't survive. NHTSA studies from the early 1980s cited vehicle incompatibility as a major factor in fatal accidents, the difference in mass and structure between cars. The Mark IV became a prime example. Its design was defensive for the driver, offensive for everyone else. This imbalance in crash outcomes ultimately helped shape the modern philosophy of safety engineering, where energy absorption and deformation, not sheer mass, became the standard. The Mark IV raises a profound moral question in automotive history. Is a car truly safe if it keeps its own occupants alive but kills everyone else? The Lincoln's existence was rooted in an age of personal luxury, not shared responsibility. Automakers sold the idea that comfort and size equaled protection, without considering the collective safety of the road. The result was a decade of cars that unintentionally weaponized their own strength, and the Mark IV was one of the worst offenders. By the late 1970s, the combination of the oil crisis, new emissions laws, and changing safety standards forced automakers to downsize. The Mark IV's successor, the Mark V, grew even heavier, before being replaced by the downsized Mark VI in 1980, a car that finally began incorporating energy-absorbing bumpers and more advanced safety features. But the Mark IV remains the pinnacle of 1970s excess, a monument to luxury so heavy, so overbuilt, and so out of step with safety progress that it became a moving contradiction. The Lincoln Continental Mark IV, 1972 to 1976, was a masterpiece of style and comfort, yet also a machine that represented the dangerous arrogance of automotive excess. Its weight, power, and presence made it the king of American roads, but also a silent executioner in the physics of traffic collisions. It was safe for the few and deadly for the many. A paradox of privilege wrapped in chrome and vinyl. In the end, the Mark IV reminds us that true safety isn't about building a fortress. It's about designing cars that share protection, not domination. Number 3. When the Chevrolet Corvair debuted in 1959 for the 1960 model year, it looked like something entirely new for Detroit. This compact rear-engine car promised European-style handling and efficiency at a time when most American cars were enormous front-engine cruisers. General Motors wanted to compete with imports like the Volkswagen Beetle, and the Corvair seemed the perfect solution. But what began as an engineering experiment quickly spiraled into one of the most infamous automotive controversies in U.S. history, one that would redefine safety standards and consumer rights. The Corvair broke nearly every American engineering convention of its day. Instead of a traditional water-cooled front engine, it used a rear-mounted, air-cooled flat six, a first for GM. The engine gave the car a unique weight distribution, nearly 38% front, 62% rear, which in theory improved traction and simplified packaging. The trunk was now in the front, and the car's sleek, minimalist design made it stand out on American roads filled with chrome-heavy land yachts. But that same rear-engine layout came with a dark side. The swing-axle rear suspension, borrowed from European designs, allowed each rear wheel to move independently. In sudden turns or emergency maneuvers, the suspension geometry could cause extreme oversteer, where the rear end snapped loose without warning. Once that happened, recovery was nearly impossible, especially for average American drivers who had never experienced such behavior. From its first years, reports began to emerge of Corvairs spinning out or flipping during sharp cornering. Tire pressure was a crucial factor. The car required a specific pressure differential, 15 psi front, 26 psi rear, to maintain stability. However, most owners never knew this. Tire shops routinely inflated all four tires equally, creating a setup that made the Corvair even more unstable. When these cars lost control, the results were often catastrophic. In moderate-speed collisions, the lightweight body provided little protection, and the engine placement meant rear impacts were especially deadly. By the late 1960s, many Corvairs still on the road had been involved in severe, often fatal accidents. What made things worse was that GM had known about the Corvair's handling issues early on. Internal testing documented instability under hard cornering, yet the company pressed ahead with production to meet deadlines and market pressure. Unsafe at Any Speed, the book that changed everything. In 1965, a young attorney named Ralph Nader published Unsafe at Any Speed, a scathing exposé on the American auto industry's disregard for safety. The opening chapter focused on the Corvair, calling it the one-car accident. Nader argued that GM had prioritized style and cost savings over human lives, accusing the company of ignoring its engineers' warnings. GM's reaction backfired spectacularly. Instead of addressing the criticism, they attempted to discredit Nader in hiring private investigators to dig into his personal life. When this became public knowledge, Congress launched hearings into automotive safety, and GM executives were forced to apologize publicly. The scandal gave birth to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, NHTSA, and led to the first federal vehicle safety standards in 1966. The second-generation Corvair and its legacy. To GM's credit, the 1965 redesign of the Corvair corrected most of the original's flaws. The swing axle was replaced by a more sophisticated independent rear suspension, and handling improved dramatically. Even critics admitted the new version was much safer and more refined. But the damage was already done. The Corvair name was permanently tarnished. By 1969, production ended quietly, overshadowed by the rise of the Mustang and GM's own Camaro. Yet early Corvairs remained on the road into the 1970s and continued to cause accidents due to their unpredictable handling, aging tires, and poor maintenance. The car's reputation as a rolling death trap persisted long after the last one left the factory. The Corvair story isn't just about one flawed car. It's about a turning point in American automotive culture. It exposed the industry's reluctance to prioritize safety and forced lawmakers to hold automakers accountable. Ironically, while the Corvair became a scapegoat for unsafe design, it helped ignite the movement that made every car that followed safer. The Chevrolet Corvair stands as one of the most paradoxical vehicles in automotive history. It was bold, innovative, and daring, yet disastrously engineered for real-world driving. Its swing-axle suspension made it unpredictable, and its handling flaws cost countless lives. But from those failures came lasting reforms that reshaped the industry. In a tragic way, the Corvair's legacy lives on in every crumple zone, airbag, and safety test that protect drivers today. It remains a sobering reminder that innovation without responsibility can be deadly, even when it begins with good intentions. Number 2. When American Motors Corporation, AMC, introduced the Gremlin on April 1, 1970, many thought it was a joke, and in some ways, it was. The Gremlin was AMC's desperate attempt to jump into the growing subcompact market, led by the Volkswagen Beetle and the emerging wave of Japanese imports. Built on a shortened Hornet platform, the Gremlin promised affordability, simplicity, and fuel economy. But what AMC created was not just a small car, it was a dangerously small car in an era when safety engineering was still in its infancy. The Gremlin's size and structure would ultimately prove to be its greatest flaw, especially in one area: crash protection. Rear-end collisions turn this quirky little car into a death trap, with devastating consequences for occupants. AMC's engineers had limited time and budget. Rather than designing a new subcompact from scratch, they simply cut 12 inches off the rear of the Hornet. The result was a car that ended abruptly behind the rear axle, a design so abrupt that critics joked it looked like someone stopped drawing halfway through. The Gremlin's goal was clear: sell a cheap, American-made small car to compete with imports. Starting at just under $1,900, it undercut the Volkswagen Beetle and was marketed as a practical commuter for students and budget-minded families. But practicality had its limits. By shortening the Hornet platform so drastically, AMC compromised the car's crash structure. The truncated rear end left almost no crush zone, the area designed to absorb impact energy in a collision. The most dangerous flaw in the AMC Gremlin was its short rear structure. In rear impacts, there was simply not enough metal between the bumper and the rear seat to dissipate crash forces. The energy from a high-speed hit traveled directly into the passenger compartment, often crumpling the car like an aluminum can. Crash tests from independent safety researchers in the mid-1970s showed horrifying results. At speeds as low as 30 to 35 miles per hour, the Gremlin's rear sheet metal collapsed almost instantly, trapping occupants and rupturing the fuel tank. The gas tank, mounted directly behind the rear axle and below the trunk floor, was vulnerable to puncture or tearing, sometimes causing fires, an eerily similar risk to that of the Ford Pinto. Unlike the Pinto, however, the Gremlin's design flaw wasn't just about the fuel tank, it was structural. Even if the tank didn't ignite, the car's body structure offered minimal survival space in a rear-end crash. The rear seat could be pushed forward several inches, pinning passengers against the front seats or collapsing the roof. Number 1. When Chrysler introduced the Plymouth Volaré in 1976, it was meant to be the savior of the struggling automaker, a fresh, modern compact that would replace the aging Valiant and carry Chrysler into the fuel-conscious late 1970s. But instead of becoming a symbol of progress, the Volaré quickly became one of the most recalled and dangerous cars of its time. From suspension collapses to steering failures and brake malfunctions, this so-called compact revolution nearly steered Chrysler off the road, literally. Let's explore how the Volaré's good intentions turned into a mechanical and safety catastrophe that haunted Chrysler throughout the late decade. The promise: Chrysler's clean slate. By the mid-1970s, Chrysler was in financial trouble. The oil crisis had made gas-guzzling full-size sedans unpopular, and compact imports like the Toyota Corolla and Honda Civic were dominating the market. Chrysler needed a hit. Enter the F-body platform, shared by the Plymouth Volaré and Dodge Aspen. These cars were designed to replace the venerable A-body Valiant and Dart, but with a focus on comfort, modern design, and smooth ride quality. The Volaré's name, derived from the Italian word volare, meaning to fly, suggested grace and lightness. In reality, the only thing that flew were its suspension components, straight out from under the car. At launch, Chrysler promised a new kind of American compact, touting features like improved suspension geometry, coil springs all around, and a quieter cabin. Motor Trend even named the Volaré and its twin the 1976 Car of the Year, impressed by its refinement and ride. Unfortunately, that praise didn't last long. The reality: a structural and mechanical disaster. The Volaré's downfall began almost immediately after its release. Chrysler's rush to bring the car to market meant that testing and quality control were severely compromised. The result was one of the most dangerous and unreliable cars of the 1970s, one plagued by critical mechanical and safety issues that endangered drivers. The most infamous flaw was in the front suspension system. The torsion bar and control arm setup was supposed to offer a smooth, comfortable ride. However, the metal used for the lower control arms and their mounting points was poorly treated and prone to rust. In northern climates, corrosion could eat through the suspension mounts within just a few years. In severe cases, the front suspension collapsed entirely while driving, causing the car to lurch violently or lose steering control. Reports of cars veering off the road, flipping, or spinning out began surfacing by 1977. Chrysler issued multiple recalls, one of which affected more than 1.3 million vehicles, but by then the Volaré's reputation was beyond repair. Rust was not limited to the suspension. The Volaré's body and frame components were notoriously thin and unprotected. Floor pans, fenders, and door sills could rust through within just 2 winters. In crash conditions, this corrosion drastically weakened the car's ability to protect its occupants. In several documented accidents, front-end impacts caused the frame rails to buckle, collapsing the firewall into the footwells and trapping the driver's legs. A 1978 Consumer Reports safety review even stated that the Volaré's structure can no longer be considered sound after a few years of use, citing corrosion as a factor in reduced crash protection. Beyond the suspension and rust, the Volaré also suffered from brake system defects and steering failures. Leaking master cylinders and premature brake fade were common, while the steering linkage could develop excessive play, leaving drivers struggling to keep the car in its lane at highway speeds. Combined with the suspension issues, these defects made the Volaré unstable and unpredictable, particularly in emergency maneuvers or at high speeds. Between 1976 and 1980, Chrysler issued over 20 dozen recalls for the Volaré and its twin, the Aspen. These recalls covered everything from seatbelt anchor failures to fuel leaks to steering column defects, and, most critically, suspension corrosion and collapse. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, or NHTSA, investigated multiple incidents involving fatal crashes linked to front suspension failure and steering loss. Although Chrysler eventually reinforced the components and applied better corrosion protection, the fixes came too late. By the end of the decade, the Volaré was already infamous. Mechanics called it the rust bucket that kills quietly, and used car dealers refused to accept them on trade-ins. The suspension failures weren't just mechanical inconveniences, they were deadly. When the lower control arm rusted through or separated from the frame, the front wheel could suddenly tuck inward, causing an immediate loss of steering control. At highway speeds, this often meant total disaster. Several fatal crashes were reported in which Volaire's swerved abruptly into oncoming traffic or flipped after a sudden suspension collapse. Class action lawsuits were filed against Chrysler by the late 1970s, but the company, already in financial peril, settled quietly and avoided large-scale payouts. The Volaré became symbolic of how far American automakers had fallen in terms of quality and safety compared to foreign rivals. A safety and PR disaster. The Volaré's dangerous defects were part of a broader pattern that nearly bankrupted Chrysler before Lee Iacocca's arrival. The company's reputation for safety and durability was destroyed, especially after the NHTSA investigations and public backlash. What was meant to be a modern, safe, and efficient compact ended up endangering its owners and eroding consumer trust. The Volaré, along with its Dodge Aspen sibling, became one of the most recalled American cars of the 1970s, a title that cemented its place in infamy. The Plymouth Volaré serves as a sobering reminder of what happens when cost-cutting and corporate desperation override engineering integrity. Chrysler built the car to save itself, but instead it built a safety nightmare. With its collapsing suspension, rust-prone body, failing brakes, and erratic steering, the Volaré wasn't just unreliable, it was lethally flawed. Many cars of the 1970s suffered from quality issues, but few managed to combine so many critical safety failures in one package. By the end of the decade, Volaré no longer meant to fly. For many owners, it meant to crash, sometimes fatally.